When I first met my boyfriend David at that coffee shop in Portland, Oregon, the conversation naturally turned to languages. He mentioned his Korean coworkers spoke Korean around him all day, and I casually asked if he understood any of it. Not a word, he laughed, shaking his head. It's like listening to music without knowing what the lyrics mean. I smiled and didn't correct him. The truth was, I'd been fluent in Korean since childhood. My grandmother had immigrated from Seoul in the 1960s and insisted on teaching me the language despite my parents' protests that it wasn't practical in Oregon. But something about David's easy assumption that I couldn't possibly understand made me hesitate to mention it. Maybe I wanted to see what he was really like when he thought no one was listening. That first month of dating was incredible. David worked as a software engineer at a tech startup downtown, and his team was mostly Korean immigrants on H-1B visas. He'd tell me stories about work while we cooked dinner together, describing his coworkers as brilliant but hard to connect with because of the language barrier. I wish I could understand what they're saying, he'd say while chopping vegetables. They seem like they're having the most interesting conversations. I nodded sympathetically, stirring the pasta sauce and keeping my mouth shut about understanding every word he'd overheard them say about the code base being poorly structured and their manager making questionable decisions. The deception started small. David would mention funny moments from work where his Korean teammates would burst into laughter and he'd have no idea why. They probably weren't laughing at you, I'd reassure him, even though I suspected they probably were based on the context he described, little lies to make him feel better about being left out. 2 months in, David invited me to his company's holiday party. I was nervous about meeting his coworkers, knowing I'd have to pretend not to understand their conversations all evening. The party was at this trendy restaurant in the Pearl District, with his entire team crowded around a long table near the windows. David introduced me proudly to everyone, and I smiled and waved at the 5 Korean engineers sitting together at one end. They seemed friendly enough, nodding politely and saying hello in accented English. "This is Sarah, my girlfriend," David announced, his arm around my waist. The moment we sat down, the real conversation began in Korean. "She's prettier than his last girlfriend," said Jin, the senior developer, cutting into his steak. "At least this one doesn't talk constantly like Jennifer did." "David seems happier," added Minji, the only woman on the team. "Though I still don't understand why he wears those terrible graphic t-shirts to important client meetings." I kept my expression neutral while David chatted with his manager about upcoming projects, completely oblivious to the commentary happening 3 feet away. "His coding style is improving," said Hunwoo, the team lead, dipping his bread in olive oil. "Last month I thought we'd have to reassign him, but he's finally learning proper documentation." "The client complained about his presentation skills again," Minji mentioned quietly. "Too many ums and not enough preparation. I had to fix his slides after he left yesterday." David leaned over to me between conversations. "They're probably talking about work stuff. They always switch to Korean when it gets technical." He seemed proud of his multicultural team, not realizing they were systematically critiquing his professional performance. As the evening went on, the comments got more personal. "Does he even shower regularly?" asked the newest team member, Sungmin, who just arrived from Seoul 6 months ago. "His desk always smells like old coffee and those energy drinks." "Sarah seems too good for him," Jin observed, glancing at me over his wineglass. "She has that educated look. What does she see in him?" I excused myself to the bathroom just to get away from the table and process what I was hearing. These people David considered his friends were absolutely roasting him, and he had no idea. When I came back, he was laughing at something their manager had said in English about the holiday bonus. "They really seem to like you," David whispered in my ear as we got ready to leave. "Jin keeps looking over here and smiling." Jin had actually just commented that David's breath smelled like garlic bread and wondered if I minded kissing him later. I squeezed David's hand and smiled back at Jin, who waved cheerfully. For the next 6 months, David would come home from work and share stories about his team's dynamics, always feeling left out of their inside jokes and conversations. I became his translator in the worst possible way, making up explanations for their behavior that painted them in the best light. "They seemed stressed during the code review today," he'd say, loosening his tie. "Lots of intense Korean discussions." What they'd actually been saying was that David's code was so messy they'd have to rewrite most of it over the weekend, and they were debating whether to tell their manager how bad it really was. "I think Minji likes working with me," he'd mention while we watched Netflix. "She always volunteers to be on my projects." Minji had actually been telling the others she volunteered for David's projects because she didn't trust him to complete them properly without supervision, and she'd rather fix things herself than let clients see subpar work. The guilt started eating at me around month 8. David would get so excited about small interactions with his coworkers, reading way more into their polite English responses than was actually there. He thought Jin was becoming a real friend because Jin would say, "Good morning," enthusiastically, and ask about his weekend. Jin's real opinion, expressed in Korean during their Monday meetings, was that David was the weakest programmer on the team and probably wouldn't survive the next round of layoffs. One evening in March, David came home practically glowing with excitement. "I think they're planning something special for my birthday next week," he said, hanging up his jacket. They kept talking in Korean and looking at me and grinning. My heart sank because I knew exactly what they'd been discussing. The company was implementing performance reviews, and David's name had come up as someone who might need to be let go. They were trying to figure out how to break the news gently because they genuinely liked him as a person, even if his work wasn't up to standard. I spent that week in agony, watching David get more excited about what he thought was a surprise party, while I knew his job was about to disappear. Should I warn him somehow? Find a way to suggest he polish his resume without revealing how I knew? On Friday morning, David's manager called him into the conference room. Through the glass walls, David's co-workers watched nervously while their manager explained the performance issues and budget constraints. I knew because Minji had texted the group chat in Korean, providing live updates that I could read perfectly. David came home that afternoon with a cardboard box containing his desk supplies and a letter explaining his severance package. He sat on our couch staring at the termination paperwork, completely blindsided. "I thought we were friends," he said, his voice hollow. "I thought they respected my work. How did I read everything so wrong?" I sat next to him, wanting to comfort him, but knowing I couldn't explain that his instincts hadn't been wrong about their personal affection. They did like him. They just thought he was terrible at his job. "Sometimes work relationships are complicated," I said, which was true but completely unhelpful. The next few weeks were rough. David threw himself into job searching while I worked extra hours at my graphic design firm to cover our expenses. He'd spend entire days sending out resumes and practicing coding challenges, convinced that improving his technical skills was the answer. What he didn't know was that his former co-workers had been texting in their group chat about feeling guilty for not giving him more direct feedback earlier. They discussed his interview skills and whether to warn him about specific areas companies would question. Minji had even asked if they should offer to be references, despite his performance issues. I watched David struggle with self-doubt while his former team was actually trying to help him behind the scenes. The disconnect was painful to witness. 2 months later, David landed in an interview at a different tech company in Beaverton. He was nervous because the team lead was Korean and he worried about the language barrier affecting his chances. "What if they have the same problem?" he asked while adjusting his tie. "What if I can't connect with another Korean team?" I wanted to tell him that most Korean professionals in America were perfectly comfortable conducting business in English, and that his communication issues at the previous job had more to do with his insecurity than any actual language barrier. Instead, I kissed him good luck and sent him off to the interview. He got the job. The new team was smaller, more diverse, and his manager spoke excellent English with no accent at all. David seemed happier and more confident in his work. I started to think maybe the Korean language secret would just fade away as a non-issue. Then David's birthday came around in August, and his new co-workers surprised him with a cake and a card signed by everyone. He was so touched by the gesture, especially after feeling rejected by his previous team. That evening, he showed me the card and pointed out that his Korean co-worker, Unji, had written a note in both English and Korean. "I wish I knew what the Korean part says," he said, examining the beautiful Hangul characters. "She probably wrote something really thoughtful." I looked at the note, which was actually just a simple, "Happy birthday, hope you have a great day," translated into Korean. Nothing profound, just politeness. But David stared at it like it contained ancient wisdom. "Maybe she was sharing something personal," he said, carefully placing the card on our bookshelf. Something she couldn't express in English. I nodded and changed the subject, but the guilt was building again. David was creating these elaborate narratives about Korean culture and language that weren't based in reality, and I was letting him do it. 3 months later, David announced he'd signed up for Korean language classes at Portland Community College. "I want to connect better with Korean culture," he explained, showing me the course catalogue. Maybe surprise Unji by understanding her better. This was getting out of hand. David was about to spend months struggling to learn a language I already spoke fluently, all because I'd been too cowardly to mention it at the beginning. But how could I tell him now without destroying his trust? I watched him pack his Korean textbooks and practice worksheets, heading off to class twice a week with determination. He'd come home and practice pronunciation while cooking dinner, messing up basic words I'd known since childhood. "Listen to this," he'd say, attempting to say hello with terrible tone and accent. Did I get it right? Getting better, I'd lie, dying inside. The classes were clearly frustrating him. Korean is notoriously difficult for English speakers, and David struggled with the writing system and grammar structure. He'd spend hours on homework that would have taken me 5 minutes. Maybe I'm too old to learn a new language, he'd sigh, erasing his practice sentences for the 3rd time. My brain just doesn't work this way. I wanted to help him so badly, but I dug myself into a hole too deep to climb out of easily. One Saturday morning in November, David's phone rang while he was in the shower. The caller ID showed Yoonji from work, and without thinking, I answered. Hello? I said in English. Oh, hi Sarah, Yoonji responded in Korean, clearly thinking David would have mentioned I spoke the language. Can you tell David that Monday's meeting got moved to Wednesday? The client had a scheduling conflict. Sure, I replied automatically in Korean. I'll let him know when he gets out of the shower. There was a pause. Your Korean is excellent, Yoonji said, switching to English. David never mentioned you spoke Korean. My blood went cold. Oh, I just know a few words, I lied quickly. Basic stuff. That was definitely more than basic, Yoonji laughed. Your accent is really good. Where did you learn? David emerged from the bathroom at that exact moment, steam following him as he grabbed his phone from my hand. Who was that? He asked, seeing Yoonji's name on the screen. Work call, I said, my heart pounding. Meeting got rescheduled. David chatted with Yoonji for a few minutes about the project timeline while I stood there panicking. When he hung up, I waited for him to mention that Yoonji had said something about my Korean, but he didn't bring it up. Maybe Yoonji hadn't told him. Monday morning, I got a text from an unknown number. It was Yoonji. Hi Sarah, I got your number from the company directory. Can we meet for coffee this week? I'd love to practice Korean with someone fluent. I stared at the text for 10 minutes before responding that I wasn't actually fluent, just knew some basic phrases from a college course. She replied immediately that she remembered our conversation being quite advanced for someone with basic knowledge. I was trapped. If I met with her, she'd realise how fluent I actually was. If I kept declining, she might mention something to David about our phone conversation. That evening, David came home excited about his Korean class progress. I finally got the pronunciation right for thank you, he said, demonstrating the phrase I'd been saying since age 5. Yoonji said I should keep practicing at home. That's great, I managed, wondering when Yoonji had given him pronunciation advice and what else they might have discussed. The next day, Yoonji texted again, this time with a Korean message, asking why I was pretending not to speak the language. She said she was confused about the situation and wanted to understand what was going on. I panicked and typed back in English that I thought there was some misunderstanding. She responded with a shrugging emoji and said she'd ask David about it directly. That weekend, I knew I had to come clean before Yoonji said something. David was on the couch reviewing his Korean flashcards when I sat down next to him. I need to tell you something, I started, my mouth suddenly dry. He looked up from his cards, eyebrows raised expectantly. I speak Korean, I said quickly, fluently. Have since I was a kid. David blinked several times, like he was processing the words individually. What do you mean? I mean, I understood everything Yoonji said when she called last week, and I've been understanding Korean conversations around us for months. I should have told you from the beginning. He set down his flashcards and leaned back against the couch cushions, so when I've been practicing pronunciation with you, you've been asking someone who already knew the correct way to say everything. The silence stretched between us for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. David's face went through several expressions: confusion, realization, hurt, and something that looked like embarrassment. Why didn't you tell me? He asked finally. I explained about the early conversation where he'd assumed I didn't speak Korean and how I'd felt awkward correcting him. Then about how the longer I waited, the harder it became to bring up without seeming like I'd been deliberately deceiving him. So you've been letting me struggle through these classes for months, he said slowly, when you could have just helped me learn? I wanted to tell you so many times, I said, but I didn't know how to explain why I'd hidden it initially. David picked up one of his flashcards and stared at it. Have you been laughing at me this whole time? Watching me butcher the pronunciation? Never, I said quickly. I've been proud of how hard you're working to learn. It's actually really sweet that you want to connect with Yoonji's culture. He stood up and walked to the kitchen, running water for no particular reason. I followed him and leaned against the counter while he filled and emptied the same glass 3 times. What else don't I know about you? He asked, not looking at me. Nothing like this, I said. This is the only big thing I've hidden. He nodded but didn't seem convinced. I need some time to think about this. That night, David slept in the spare room for the first time since we'd moved in together. I lay awake listening to him move around, probably not sleeping either. The apartment felt different with this new distance between us. The next morning, I made coffee for both of us and knocked on the spare room door. David was sitting on the edge of the bed, still in yesterday's clothes, looking like he hadn't slept at all. "Can we talk?" I asked, holding out his favourite mug. He took the coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table. "I keep thinking about all the times I asked you to help with pronunciation," he said. "All those evenings I spent frustrated with the homework while you just watched." "I wanted to help," I said, "but I didn't know how to explain without admitting I'd been lying from the start." "You could have told me the truth at any point," he said. "After the first week, after the first month, you chose to keep lying every single day." He was right, and I didn't have a good defense for that. I was scared you'd be angry about the initial deception. "I'm more angry about the months of continued deception," he said, setting down his mug harder than necessary. We spent the rest of that conversation going in circles, with me apologising and him trying to understand my reasoning. Neither of us raised our voices, but the hurt was obvious in everything he said. That afternoon, David called Yoonji to confirm whether I'd spoken Korean during their phone conversation. I could hear her voice through the speaker saying yes, I'd been perfectly fluent and had responded naturally in Korean without hesitation. When he hung up, David looked at me with something that might have been disappointment. "She said you spoke like a native speaker. This wasn't just knowing a few phrases." "My grandmother was from Seoul," I explained. "She taught me when I was young because she wanted to preserve the language in our family." "And you never thought to mention this in 6 months of dating someone who works with Korean people every day?" I didn't have a good answer for that either. The next week was tense. David continued going to his Korean classes, but now he'd come home and practice in front of me with this new awkwardness. He'd attempt pronunciation and wait for my feedback, but we both knew I was holding back from correcting him properly. "Just tell me if I'm saying it wrong," he'd say, frustrated after struggling with the same word for 10 minutes. "You're doing fine," I'd answer, which helped nobody. On Thursday, David came home from work, looking troubled. "Yoonji asked me today why I never mentioned you spoke Korean," he said, dropping his laptop bag by the door. "She thought it was weird that I wouldn't know something so basic about my girlfriend." "What did you tell her?" "That I'd recently found out, and it was complicated." He sat down across from me at the dinner table. She looked at me like I was an idiot for not knowing. I could imagine Yoonji's confusion. In Korean culture, language skills are often mentioned early in relationships, especially when they're relevant to someone's work or social connections. "She probably thinks we don't communicate well," David continued, "and honestly, she's not wrong." That weekend, we decided to visit my parents in Eugene, so David could meet my grandmother and understand how I'd learned Korean. The 3-hour drive south was mostly quiet, with David staring out the window while I focused on the road. My parents' house sits on 2 acres outside Eugene, with my grandmother living in the converted garage apartment my dad had built for her 5 years ago. She's 86 now, still sharp, and absolutely ruthless when she thinks someone is being disrespectful. Halabeoji would have liked him, my grandmother said in Korean after David introduced himself politely in broken Korean he'd learned from his textbook. She was referring to my grandfather who'd passed away when I was in college. "His pronunciation needs work," she continued in Korean, watching David struggle through basic greetings. "But he's trying harder than most Americans do." David smiled nervously, clearly catching none of the conversation. My mom jumped in with English, asking about his job and how we'd met. Dad started grilling him about his intentions and whether he was planning to propose anytime soon. "We're taking things slow." David answered diplomatically, while my grandmother muttered in Korean that young people these days took too long to make commitments. During dinner, my grandmother asked me in Korean why I hadn't taught David proper pronunciation if we were serious about each other. A girlfriend should help her boyfriend not embarrass himself, she said, ladling more soup into his bowl. I deflected by asking about her garden, but she wasn't letting it go. "He seems like a good boy," she continued in Korean. "But why doesn't he understand when you speak our language? Have you been hiding it from him?" My mom shot me a warning look, recognizing the dangerous territory we were entering. My grandmother had strong opinions about honesty in relationships, developed during 60 years of marriage to my grandfather. "Sarah's Korean is excellent," my mom said quickly in English, trying to steer the conversation away from my grandmother's interrogation. "She's been fluent since childhood." David looked up from his soup. "Really? I mean, I knew you understood some, but—" "She speaks better than her mother," my grandmother said in Korean, not realizing David couldn't understand. "Always has since she was small. Very smart girl." "Grandma says you have a nice smile," I translated, which wasn't remotely what she'd said. My grandmother's eyes narrowed as she realized I was mistranslating. In Korean, she asked directly why I was lying about what she'd said. My parents both tensed, recognizing the tone that meant trouble was coming. "Sarah," my grandmother said in perfect English, her voice stern. "Why are you not telling him what I actually said?" The table went completely silent. David looked between my grandmother and me, clearly sensing something was wrong, but not understanding what. Grandma sometimes mixes up languages, I said weakly. I do not mix up anything, she said firmly in English. You translated wrong on purpose. Why? David set down his spoon and looked directly at me. What did she actually say? I glanced at my parents, who were both staring at their plates like they wished they could disappear. My grandmother sat back in her chair with her arms crossed, waiting for my answer. She said I've been fluent since childhood and speak better than my mom, I admitted quietly. David's face went through the same progression of emotions I'd seen in our kitchen weeks earlier, but more intense this time. Understanding, hurt, and something that looked like betrayal. So the whole time I've been taking classes and practicing with you, you've been learning from someone who already knew everything you were trying to learn, I finished. My grandmother nodded approvingly that I'd finally told the truth, but my parents looked miserable about how it had come out. The drive home was silent, except for David asking basic questions about directions when we needed gas. He stared out the passenger window while I focused on the highway, both of us knowing we'd have to talk about this eventually, but neither ready to start. That night, David set up his laptop in the spare room, and I could hear him typing for hours. I fell asleep on the couch watching TV, not wanting to go to our bedroom alone. The next morning, I found a printed email on the kitchen counter. David had written to his Korean language teacher explaining that his girlfriend was fluent and asking if he should drop the class or continue learning independently. The teacher had responded with advice about navigating cross-cultural relationships and suggested we practice together rather than him struggling alone. I thought about quitting, David said when he came into the kitchen. But I've already paid for the semester, and I actually want to understand the language now. I could help you practice, I offered. Really help, I mean, not just pretend to evaluate your pronunciation. He poured coffee and leaned against the counter, still keeping distance between us. I don't know if I trust you to be honest about what I need to improve. That stung, but I deserved it. I've been thinking all night about what else you might be hiding, he continued. If you could lie about something this big for 6 months, what else don't I know? Nothing, I said. This is the only significant thing I've hidden from you. How would I know that's true? I didn't have an answer that would satisfy either of us. Later that week, David started practicing Korean with Yoonji during their lunch breaks at work. She was excited to have someone to speak with and began teaching him more advanced conversational phrases. He'd come home and share what he'd learned, describing Eunji as patient and encouraging. She said my pronunciation is improving faster than most students, he mentioned while we folded laundry. Maybe I have a natural ear for it. I knew Eunji was probably just being polite, but I didn't want to crush his confidence when he was finally making progress. One evening in October, David came home with a strange expression on his face. Yoonji asked me something weird today, he said, sitting down across from me. She wanted to know if you'd ever lived in Korea because your accent on the phone was so natural. What did you tell her? That you'd studied it in college, but I realised I've never actually asked you details about how you learned. He leaned forward slightly. How did you learn Korean, Sarah? Really? I took a deep breath and told him the whole story. My grandmother immigrating alone at age 20. Her insistence on maintaining Korean in our household despite my parents' resistance. The Saturday mornings spent learning Hangul at the kitchen table. The Korean dramas we'd watched together while my parents were at work. So you grew up bilingual, David said when I finished. Essentially, yes. And you never thought this was relevant to mention when I started taking classes? I thought about it every day, I said. But I'd already lied about understanding it initially, and I didn't know how to backtrack without admitting I'd been deceiving you. David rubbed his face with both hands. This is like finding out you're a professional chef after watching me burn dinner for 6 months. The comparison was uncomfortably accurate. That weekend, we decided to have dinner with both sets of parents to explain the situation and get their perspective on how to move forward. My parents drove up from Eugene, while David's parents came over from their house in southeast Portland. The conversation was awkward from the start. My grandmother sat at the head of the table, switching between English and Korean, while David's parents tried to follow along. My mom kept apologising for not bringing up my language skills earlier. We assumed David knew, my dad explained. Sarah's been speaking Korean since she was 3 years old. It never occurred to us it would be a secret. David's mom asked why I hadn't mentioned it, and I gave the same explanation about the initial misunderstanding snowballing into a bigger deception. His dad, who'd been quiet most of the evening, finally spoke up. Seems like you both made mistakes, he said, cutting his steak methodically. David assumed something without asking, and Sarah let him assume it instead of correcting him. My grandmother nodded approvingly. Assumptions kill relationships, she said in English. Always ask direct questions. David's parents exchanged glances. We've had our own communication problems over the years, his mom said. Marriage takes work. After they left, David and I sat in our living room with our laptops open, both of us scrolling through articles about rebuilding trust in relationships. The advice was consistent: complete honesty going forward, patience with the healing process, and professional counselling if needed. I want to try, David said, closing his laptop. But I need to know there aren't other secrets hiding. There aren't, I said. I promise. How can I believe promises from someone who lied for 6 months? I didn't have an answer that would fix that immediately. The next week, we started couples counselling with a therapist recommended by David's friend from work. Her office was in a converted house in the Hawthorne district with comfortable chairs and soft lighting that was supposed to make difficult conversations easier. Trust rebuilding takes time, the therapist explained during our first session. Sarah, you'll need to demonstrate consistent honesty going forward. David, you'll need to be open to believing that demonstration when you see it. She gave us homework assignments focused on daily check-ins and expressing needs directly rather than making assumptions. We practiced having conversations where we each stated what we needed from the other person instead of expecting the other to guess. I need you to help me with Korean pronunciation when I ask, David said during one exercise. I need you to believe me when I say I'm not hiding anything else, I responded. The sessions were exhausting, but helpful. We learned that my tendency to avoid conflict by staying quiet had contributed to the problem, while David's habit of making assumptions without asking direct questions had made the situation worse. By December, we'd established new communication patterns. David would ask me directly about things instead of guessing, and I practiced speaking up immediately when something bothered me instead of letting it build up. The Korean language practice became part of our evening routine. David would work through his textbook exercises while I provided feedback and correction. He was making real progress now that he had accurate guidance, though he was frustrated about all the time he'd wasted with incorrect pronunciation. I sound like a completely different person when you correct me, he said one evening, practicing a conversation exercise, like I've been speaking nonsense for months. You were learning, I reminded him. Everyone sounds terrible when they're learning a new language. You didn't, he pointed out. You learned as a kid. One evening in January, David came home from work with news that his team was getting a new Korean developer who'd just moved to Portland from Busan. Her English isn't as strong as Yoonji's, he explained, but now I can actually help with basic communication instead of being useless. I was proud of how much his Korean had improved, though it stung to remember how much easier his adjustment at work could have been if I'd been honest from the beginning. The next week, David invited me to his company's quarterly team dinner. This time, I'd be meeting his coworkers as someone who spoke Korean, and I was nervous about how they'd react to the previous deception. The restaurant was a Korean barbecue place in southeast Portland, and David's team had reserved the back room. Unji introduced me to everyone in both English and Korean, and I responded naturally in Korean for the first time in public with David. Your Korean is really excellent, said the new team member, Jisoo, in Korean. Where did you study? I explained about my grandmother while David listened, understanding most of the conversation thanks to his months of classes. He even jumped in with comments and questions, though his grammar was still shaky. David's pronunciation has improved so much, Unji told me in Korean. He must be practicing regularly. We practice together every evening, I replied, which made David smile. Over dinner, the conversation flowed between English and Korean naturally, with David participating more than he ever had before. He asked Jisoo about Busan in Korean, and she answered enthusiastically about her hometown's beaches and seafood. This is what I was hoping for, David said quietly to me while the others debated the best Korean restaurants in Portland, actually being part of the conversation instead of sitting on the outside. Driving home, we both felt like we'd turned a corner. The evening had shown us what our relationship could look like with complete honesty, and it was better than the version built on my deception. In February, we moved David's Korean textbooks and flashcards to the living room coffee table so we could practice together more naturally. I started teaching him cultural context, along with grammar, explaining the formality levels and when to use different speech patterns. Korean has all these layers of respect built into the language, I explained while we worked through honorific forms. It's not just what you say, but how you say it, depending on who you're talking to. No wonder I've been confused, David said, reviewing the different verb endings. I thought it was just vocabulary and pronunciation. These study sessions became our new way of spending time together. We'd work through exercises while cooking dinner, practice conversation during commercial breaks, and review vocabulary before bed. Learning together created a different kind of intimacy than we'd had before. One Saturday morning in March, David surprised me by having a full conversation with my grandmother in Korean when we visited Eugene. His grammar wasn't perfect, but he expressed genuine thoughts about his work and our relationship. My grandmother was impressed enough to switch to more complex topics, discussing Korean history and cultural traditions. Much better, she told me in Korean after David went to help my dad with yard work. He shows proper respect when he speaks. You taught him well. He's been working very hard, I replied. And you? She asked. Have you learned anything from this situation? I admitted that hiding the language had been a mistake that nearly cost me my relationship. She nodded and said that honesty was harder than deception, but always worth the effort. That afternoon, David and I drove to Crater Lake for a weekend camping trip. The 3-hour drive gave us time to talk without the distractions of home. David asked questions about my childhood that he'd never thought to ask before, and I answered more completely than I had about anything in months. I wish I'd known about your grandmother earlier, he said as we set up our tent. I would have loved learning about Korean culture from her instead of just struggling through textbooks. You can still do that, I said. She'd love teaching you traditional recipes and showing you her old photographs from Seoul. We spent that evening by the campfire, David practicing Korean phrases while I told him stories about growing up with my grandmother's traditions. For the first time in months, our conversation felt easy and natural. Back in Portland, David's confidence at work improved dramatically. He could participate in Korean conversations during lunch breaks and understand cultural references his coworkers made. His manager noticed the change and mentioned that David seemed more integrated with the team. It's amazing how much more connected I feel, David told me one evening. Yesterday, Jin made a joke in Korean during the meeting, and I actually understood and laughed at the right time, instead of smiling blankly. I was happy for him, but still felt guilty about all the months he'd spent feeling left out when I could have helped from the beginning. In April, we attended a Korean cultural festival in Portland's downtown park. David was excited to practice his language skills with native speakers and test his understanding of different regional accents. We walked around the food booths and craft vendors, David attempting conversations with elderly Korean vendors while I stayed close enough to help if needed. At one booth selling traditional clothing, the vendor complimented David's Korean in front of me, saying he spoke well for a beginner. David beamed with pride, and I felt genuinely happy for him without the guilt that had shadowed every previous language interaction. Your girlfriend teaches you well, the vendor said to David in Korean, gesturing toward me. She's an excellent teacher, David replied in Korean, his pronunciation much clearer than it had been months earlier. The vendor switched to rapid Korean, asking me where I'd learned and complimenting my fluency. I responded naturally while David listened, catching maybe half of what we said, but not looking frustrated about missing parts. I'm still learning, he interjected in Korean when there was a pause. But I understand more every week. Walking back to the car, David was quiet for several blocks before speaking. Today felt different, he said, like we were actually a team instead of me struggling while you watched. We were a team, I agreed. That's what I want us to be. 2 weeks later, David's performance review at work came back excellent across all categories. His manager mentioned specifically that his integration with the Korean team members had improved project communication and efficiency. David felt proud of earning respect through his own effort rather than just being tolerated. Unji said she recommended me for the lead position on the new mobile app project, he told me over dinner. She said my communication skills have become one of my strengths. I was proud of him for earning that recognition, honestly, through his own hard work and improvement. In May, we received an invitation to Yoonji's wedding in Seattle. She'd included a note in Korean thanking us both for being good friends and saying she was excited for us to meet her family. David read the note slowly, translating most of it correctly, and asked me to check his understanding of a few phrases. You got almost everything right, I said, reviewing his translation. Just missed one formal ending, but the meaning came through perfectly. We RSVP'd yes, and David spent the next week researching appropriate Korean wedding gifts and customs. He wanted to show respect for the traditions without making cultural mistakes. The wedding was beautiful, held at a garden venue overlooking Puget Sound. David navigated conversations with Yoonji's Korean relatives throughout the reception, and I watched him genuinely connect with people instead of feeling isolated by language barriers. Your boyfriend speaks Korean very well, Yoonji's aunt told me in Korean during the bouquet toss, and you make a lovely couple. Thank you, I replied. He's worked very hard to learn. During the drive back to Portland, David was energized from the conversations he'd had. I understood maybe 70% of everything, he estimated. 6 months ago, I would have caught maybe 10%. You should be proud of that progress, I said. Learning a language as an adult is incredibly difficult. I couldn't have done it without your help these past few months, he said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. The real help, I mean. That night, we had the conversation we'd been building toward for weeks. David said he thought we'd learn to communicate better through working on Korean together, and our counselling sessions had given us tools for handling disagreements more directly. I want to try being a real couple again, he said, not just roommates co-parenting and practicing language skills. I want that too, I said, but I understand if you need more time to trust me completely. Trust isn't going to come back overnight, he admitted, but I think we're moving in the right direction. We decided to try sleeping in the same bedroom again, but we moved slowly, like we were learning to be together all over again. The first few nights felt awkward, both of us staying on our own sides of the bed and being overly polite about small things like who got the bathroom first in the morning. By June, our routine had settled into something that felt sustainable. David continued his Korean classes, but now came home to practice with someone who could give him real feedback. I started joining him for lunch with his Korean coworkers sometimes, participating in conversations instead of watching from the sidelines. It's funny, Unji mentioned to me one afternoon while David was in a client meeting. I always wondered why you didn't speak Korean with him at first. It seemed like such an obvious thing to share. I made it complicated when it should have been simple, I admitted. But you figured it out, she said. That's what matters. One evening in July, David came home with news that his company was opening a Seoul office and looking for team members interested in international assignments. They want people who can work with Korean developers directly, he explained, showing me the job posting. My language skills might actually qualify me for something like this. Are you interested? I asked, though the idea of moving to Korea both excited and terrified me. Maybe in a few years, he said, after I'm more fluent and we're more settled. The possibility gave us something to work toward together, instead of just recovering from past mistakes. In August, we celebrated David's birthday with both families and his work friends at a Korean barbecue restaurant. David handled all the ordering in Korean and explained the different cuts of meat to his parents, who were trying Korean food for the first time. My grandmother sat next to David's mom, patiently teaching her how to wrap the meat in lettuce leaves while they communicated through gestures and broken English. David's dad asked questions about Korean culture that showed he'd been researching on his own. "This is nice," David said quietly to me, while everyone was focused on grilling beef. Everyone getting along without any translation needed. It is nice, I agreed, watching our family's attempt to communicate across language barriers with good humour and patience. After dinner, David opened his gifts, including a advanced Korean grammar book from Unji and a traditional Korean tea set from my grandmother. He thanked everyone in both English and Korean, his pronunciation confident enough that my grandmother nodded approvingly. That night, while we were cleaning up wrapping paper, David brought up something that had been on his mind. "I've been thinking about how different this year could have been if you'd told me about speaking Korean from the beginning." "Better or worse?" I asked. "Different," he said. "Maybe easier in some ways. I wouldn't have felt so isolated at work those first few months. But maybe I wouldn't have been as motivated to learn if I thought you could just translate everything for me." I considered this. "You definitely worked harder because you thought you were learning independently. And you learned to be more direct about difficult topics because we had to work through this mess," he pointed out. "So, maybe we're better for having gone through it?" "Maybe," he said, "though I don't recommend deception as a relationship-building strategy." We both laughed, and it felt like the first genuinely light moment we'd had about the situation since it started. In September, David surprised me by signing us up for a Korean cooking class taught by my grandmother in her apartment kitchen. She'd been mentioning for months that David should learn to make proper kimchi and bulgogi if he was serious about understanding Korean culture. Every Saturday morning, we'd drive to Eugene and spend 3 hours learning family recipes, while my grandmother corrected David's technique and praised his willingness to learn traditional methods. "Korean cooking is about patience," she told him in Korean while he practiced cutting vegetables to uniform sizes, like learning language, no shortcuts to doing it properly. David nodded seriously, understanding enough to catch her meaning even when he missed specific words. These cooking lessons became our new shared tradition, replacing the awkward family dinners and tense practice sessions with something productive and enjoyable. David was developing genuine appreciation for Korean cuisine beyond the restaurant food he'd known before. "I never realized how much technique goes into making kimchi," he told my grandmother in Korean, struggling with the formal verb endings but getting his point across. "Now you understand why it takes generations to perfect," she replied, approving of his attempt even while correcting his grammar. By October, we'd been in counselling for 6 months and had developed what our therapist called sustainable communication patterns. We scheduled our final session with the understanding that we could return if needed, but we'd built tools for handling disagreements without professional mediation. "You've both learned to express needs directly rather than making assumptions. our therapist observed during our last appointment. And you've practiced rebuilding trust through consistent actions over time. David and I agreed that the counselling had been worth the investment, even though some sessions had been emotionally exhausting. That Halloween, we hosted David's work team for a party at our apartment. I helped plan a menu combining Korean and American foods, and David practiced hosting conversations in both languages. His co-workers brought their partners, and the evening turned into a cultural exchange with everyone sharing stories about their backgrounds. David's Korean has improved so much this year, Jisoo mentioned to me while we served dessert. He went from understanding nothing to participating in our technical discussions. He's very dedicated when he sets his mind to something, I said, watching David explain Korean drinking games to his manager's husband. And you're a good teacher, she added. Not everyone has patience for helping someone learn. The party lasted until midnight, with everyone reluctant to leave the comfortable atmosphere we'd created. David seemed genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen since the early days of our relationship, before the deception had started weighing on everything. In November, we got unexpected news that changed our entire perspective on the past year. David received a job offer from a Korean technology company with offices in both Seoul and Portland. They wanted someone who could facilitate communication between their Korean and American teams. They specifically mentioned my Korean language skills and cross-cultural experience, David explained, showing me the offer letter. This wouldn't have been possible without everything that happened this year. The salary was significantly higher than his current position, and the work sounded more interesting and challenging. David was excited about the opportunity, but wanted to discuss it thoroughly before deciding. Would you consider moving to Seoul eventually if this works out? He asked while we reviewed the job description together. I think I'd like that, I said, realizing I meant it. My Korean is fluent, but I've never actually lived in Korea. It could be an adventure. We spent that weekend researching Seoul neighborhoods and international schools, imagining a future neither of us had considered, before the language deception had forced us to rebuild our relationship from the ground up. David accepted the position and started in January. His new job required regular video conferences with the Seoul office, and I'd sometimes overhear him facilitating discussions between teams, his Korean still imperfect but functional and improving constantly. This feels like what I was meant to be doing, he told me after a particularly successful project launch that required coordination between 3 countries. I never would have found this path if you hadn't hidden your Korean skills initially. So, you're grateful I lied to you for 6 months? I asked teasingly. Grateful for where we ended up, he clarified, not grateful for the deception itself. Looking back now, I understand that my initial impulse to hide my Korean fluency came from insecurity about being judged or stereotyped. David's assumption that I couldn't possibly speak Korean had felt safer than revealing another way I might be different from what he expected. But hiding the truth had cost us both months of unnecessary struggle and nearly destroyed our relationship before it really began. David had felt isolated and incompetent at work, while I had accurate information that could have helped him. I'd watched him suffer through language classes that could have been collaborative learning experiences. The deception had revealed other communication problems in our relationship too. My tendency to avoid difficult conversations and David's habit of making assumptions rather than asking direct questions. Working through the Korean situation had forced us to develop better patterns for everything else. In March of this year, David was selected to lead a 3-month project in Seoul, and we decided I should come with him. My company approved remote work for the duration, and we rented a small apartment in Gangnam district. Living in Korea was completely different from speaking Korean in Portland. David was immersed in the language and culture in ways that accelerated his learning dramatically. Meanwhile, I got to experience my grandmother's birthplace for the first time as an adult. Your Korean sounds so natural here, David observed one evening after we'd spent the day exploring Bukchon-Hanok village. Like you're finally in your element. It feels like coming home to a place I've never been, I said, which surprised me with its truth. We visited my grandmother's childhood neighborhood in Seoul, finding the house where she'd grown up before immigrating to America. The building had been torn down with a modern apartment complex, but the street layout was the same as in her old photographs. David took pictures of everything while I translated historical markers and asked elderly neighbors about what the area had been like in the 1960s. His Korean was strong enough now to follow most of the conversations, and he asked thoughtful questions about post-war reconstruction and economic development. Your grandmother would be proud to see you here, he said as we walked through the neighborhood where her family had lived. She'd be proud of you too, I said, for working so hard to understand her culture. The Seoul project was successful enough that David's company offered him a permanent position splitting time between the Portland and Seoul offices. We accepted, planning to spend 4 months per year in Korea and 8 months in Portland. This is exactly the kind of international career I never thought I'd have, David said while we packed up our Seoul apartment to return to Portland. A year ago, I couldn't even say hello properly in Korean. A year ago, I was too scared to admit I spoke Korean, I replied. We've both changed a lot. Back in Portland that summer, we started hosting monthly dinners for David's work team and their families. These gatherings became a blend of Korean and American traditions, with everyone contributing dishes and stories from their backgrounds. My grandmother drove up from Eugene for several of these dinners, delighting in having native Korean speakers to converse with while also teaching David's American coworkers basic phrases and cultural concepts. David has become a bridge between cultures, she observed to me in Korean during one dinner. That's a valuable skill. He worked hard for it, I said. And you learn to support instead of hiding, she replied. Also valuable. In August, David proposed during one of our weekend camping trips to Mount Hood. He'd been practicing the proposal in Korean for weeks, wanting to incorporate both languages into the moment. His pronunciation was still imperfect, but the sentiment was clear and heartfelt. I want to build a life with you based on complete honesty, he said in Korean, kneeling beside our campfire. Will you marry me? I said yes in both languages, crying as he slipped the ring onto my finger. We'd planned to keep the engagement quiet until we told our families, but David was so excited he called everyone from the mountaintop. The wedding planning became another opportunity for cultural blending. We decided on a ceremony that incorporated both American and Korean traditions, with my grandmother helping design elements that would honor her heritage while including David's family. Korean weddings have beautiful symbolism, David said while we reviewed ceremony options. I want to understand the meaning behind everything we include. We spent hours researching traditional elements and their significance, with David taking notes and asking us questions like he was studying for an exam. His dedication to understanding rather than just participating showed how much he'd grown since his early days of making assumptions about Korean culture. Our wedding took place the following spring at a garden venue outside Portland. The ceremony included traditional Korean elements like the payback tea ceremony alongside American vows and readings. David performed the traditional bows to my grandmother with proper form, having practiced for weeks to show appropriate respect. His form is very good, my grandmother said in Korean during the reception, watching David interact with her elderly friends from Eugene's Korean community. He understands the important things. David gave a speech in both English and Korean, thanking both families and acknowledging how our relationship had grown through facing difficult challenges together. His Korean wasn't perfect, but it was confident and sincere. Learning Sarah's language taught me that understanding someone means working to see the world through their perspective, he said, looking directly at me, and that assumptions are no substitute for honest conversation. During our honeymoon in Seoul, we visited my grandmother's family temple, and David participated in traditional ceremonies with guidance from the monks. His respectful approach and genuine interest in learning impressed everyone we met. You married someone who honors your heritage, my cousin in Seoul told me in Korean while David practiced calligraphy with her son. That's rare and precious. Watching David carefully form Korean characters with intense concentration, I realized how far we'd both traveled from that first conversation in the coffee shop, where a simple question about language had started this entire complicated journey. Now, 2 years after the deception began and 1 year after the truth came out, our relationship is built on foundations we chose deliberately rather than assumptions we made accidentally. David's Korean continues improving, and my honesty about everything else has become natural rather than forced. We still practice Korean together every evening, but now it's collaborative learning rather than hidden knowledge. David teaches me technical vocabulary he learns at work, while I help him navigate cultural nuances and family interactions. Sometimes I'm grateful for how everything happened, David said recently while we planned our next trip to Seoul. The difficult wave taught us things about communication that we might never have learned otherwise. I'm grateful we survived it, I replied, but I don't recommend deception as a relationship-building strategy. Definitely not, he agreed. But I'm glad we both chose to do the work to fix what got broken. Looking back, I understand that my initial impulse to hide my Korean fluency came from wanting to avoid complications in a new relationship. But hiding important things about ourselves from people we love creates bigger complications than honesty ever could. David's assumption that I couldn't speak Korean wasn't malicious, just uninformed. And my decision to let him continue assuming was understandable, but ultimately harmful to both of us. We both learned that making space for difficult conversations early prevents much bigger problems later. Our story doesn't have a neat, perfect ending because real relationships don't work that way. We're still learning to trust each other completely. still practicing direct communication when it would be easier to make assumptions. But we're doing that work together now, as partners rather than people hiding from each other. The Korean language that started as a deception between us became the tool that taught us how to rebuild trust through patient, consistent effort. Every conversation we have now, whether in English or Korean, carries the understanding that honesty is harder than deception, but always worth the effort. And David's Korean is getting really good. Last week, he made my grandmother laugh during our video call by telling a joke entirely in Korean. She understood every word, and so did I. Sometimes the hardest way forward is the only way forward, even when you can't see where it's leading until you've already arrived.